All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for a trip to northern Sicily with the Traveling Librarian. We're joined by Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for another one of his popular armchair travel presentations. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, we're going to journey to northern Sicily at the crossroads of the Mediterranean and influenced by many different cultures throughout its history. While a part of Italy, Sicily has a distinct culture, dialect, cuisine, and attitude that makes it a place apart. We'll start in, you can correct me later, Jeff, here, Taormina. We're going to climb Mount Etna, and we're going to follow the northern coast to Palermo, the capital, and some of the beautiful towns of the West Coast. And so Jeff is the recently retired head of reference services at the Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. So all 116 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us this morning. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everybody, for having me back again. I'm glad to see another big crowd. And as Robert said, feel free to put any of your questions in the chat or in the Q&A as we go along. I'll try and keep an eye. I'm also just going to quickly pop my email into the chat. So after the program, if anybody has any questions, I'm always happy to take questions or comments by email. Feel free to get in touch with me and we can talk later. But let me share my screen and we will get going. Oh, don't press the leave button. Share screen. There we go. Okay. So this is a trip that I took about, 4 years ago? It was right before COVID hit, one of the last international trips I did before COVID. And I'm going to try and give you kind of the 60-second history of Sicily, which is hard to do. But as you can see from this map, Sicily is really geographically at the crossroads in the middle of the Mediterranean. And it's also figuratively at the crossroads because it has influences from many different cultures over the centuries, from the original Sicilians, ages and ages ago, and then the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Byzantines, the Ostrogoths, the Ottomans, the Bourbons, the Venetians, you name it. Everybody was there right up until even the British, and right up until 1860, when the Italians came in and essentially unified Italy into the modern state that it is today. Putting Sicily on the map, I just want to show you this was the route that we took. We drove around the entire island of Sicily over a period of a little shy of 2 weeks, which is more than enough time, I think, to see most of the big sites. You could do it in a week and a half. You could do it even in a week if you were rushed, but I think a week and a half is good for seeing most of the important sites. Today, we're going to talk mostly about the northern side, so everything from here all the way across the northern coast, and we'll end up in Marsala. And just to give you an idea of the geography, Sicily is about the same size as Massachusetts, give or take. This is a map of Massachusetts with the outline of Sicily overlaid across it, but it has far fewer people. There's only about 5 million, which is about maybe 8% of the total population of Italy. And the geology of it is also very interesting. It's a very mountainous region, particularly along the northern coast, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today. And the most obvious feature that you can see here, this giant pimple over on the east coast, is Mount Etna, which is one of the largest, actually I think it is the largest, and certainly one of the most active volcanoes in Europe. It's huge. It's about 11,000 feet, which even if it were not a volcano, would make it an incredibly imposing geologic feature. And it completely dominates the landscape on the eastern side of the island. But on a clear day, you can even see it from pretty far away. On the West Coast, you can almost see it off in the distance. We're going to start in Taormina, which is one of the older towns, and certainly one of the most visited. Like most of Sicily, it was settled very long ago. And it's high up over the Eastern Sea on the eastern coast. It wasn't really until the 19th century, though, that it blossomed as a tourist destination, and partly because of the location and the beautiful views, partly because of the temperate climate, it became one of those places that a lot of 19th century romantic writers and artists would come to spend the winters, and they kind of placed their stamp on that at that time, and it became one of the places to go in the Mediterranean. I do have to show you this is kind of funny, because it sits so high up. It's about 700 feet up on a plateau over the Ionian Sea. Getting up there, this is the GPS route that we took to get up there. I just wanted to show you how complicated it is to actually drive up all of these circuitous mountain roads to get up to the top of where the city actually is. It's got gorgeous architecture, as does most of Sicily. One of the nice things about Sicily is the layered cultures. Because all of those different cultures have influenced the island over the centuries, they've all left their mark. And architecture is one of the main ways in which you can see that. And the ones that I think are most visible are the Baroque and the Byzantine, and we'll see a lot of that as we go through the cities and towns that we look at this morning. Most of Taormina is pedestrianized, which makes it a lovely place to stay, because there's no traffic, there's no cars. It is very touristy. It's probably the most visited place in Sicily, but it's still lovely. And it has beautiful public gardens on different terraces. This particular one, which is used to be a private garden for the villa of a very wealthy expat woman who lived there decades ago, is now a public park. And it has some lovely trees and follies and things like that, and looks out over the ocean. But the details, just walking around Taormina, they're delightful. It's a very typical Italian tourist town. And like a lot of other Sicilian towns, it's known for its ceramics. So you will see those everywhere as decorations, and also, of course, as things that you can buy. Here's a good example of the Baroque, but also the medieval. This palace actually is now the tourist bureau. Here are some old puppets. Sicily has a long tradition of puppet theater that goes back to the Middle Ages. And these particular ones that you can see in this photograph are antiques. You can actually see a performance, but if you do plan on doing that, make sure that you do it way ahead of time, because they're incredibly popular and they do tend to sell out. But they sell modern versions of these old puppets, marionettes essentially. And this was in the tourist bureau. They have a museum that shows some of the actual historic ones from the 19th century and earlier. The other thing, of course, that you'll see a lot of, because it's Italy, is food. So there are pastries, cannolis, meringues. Over on the right, you can see some marzipan, and you can't pass those by. Particularly since when we were there, we had a couple of days of really actually torrential rain, which was unusual at that time of year. So when it's raining like that, the best thing that you can do is just go inside and have coffee and pastries. Here are just some scenes around the town. And the central square, this is the Piazza del Duomo, the cathedral. And you can see the Baroque fountain in front of it. I'm not sure if you can see in this image, but the strange little sculpture at the top is the symbol of the town. It's a half woman and half horse, which is an unusual little thing, but it's the traditional symbol of the city. And the main shopping street, which is completely pedestrianized. and has a lot of very elegant shops and cafes and restaurants. We happened to stay in a beautiful guest house that was way up high, excuse me, and it used to be a convent back in the 16th century. And so you can see the decoration inside. This is the breakfast room. It was a wonderful place to stay, and the view from our balcony looking out over the ocean. Fortunately, the next day the weather was lovely, perfectly clear. And the advantage to that is you get to see Taormina's traditional views, which look down the coast. Remember, we are on the east coast of Sicily right now, over the Ionian Sea, and we're looking south down the coast. And there's a spectacular view of Mount Etna. If the weather is clear, you can see that up in the background here. This little rock down at the bottom is called Isola Bella, a little islet that's connected to the coast and has some rocky inlets where you can go swimming. And this is looking north towards Messini, which is the big town right at the point where Sicily comes closest to mainland Italy, where the toe is. If you think of the boot of Italy, the toe comes very close to Sicily. That's Calabria on the mainland. You can kind of see that often, just off in the distance. That's what that dark shape is there. But the views, you can see why romantic artists and writers and so on came here to just stay, enjoy the warm winter weather, and be inspired by the beauty to create novels and artworks and so forth. It's just a spectacular location. And as I mentioned, it's also quite old. The most famous attraction in Taormina is actually the ancient Greek theater. Here I am. Oh, I just realized I'm actually wearing the exact same shirt that I was wearing there. This theater is impressive not just because of its architecture, but because of its location. And it was built there for this reason. The backdrop is Mount Etna. You could actually sit in this theater and observe lava erupting, which is even more noticeable at night, off in the distance, which must have just been an incredible sight. Etna erupts fairly frequently even today. I think it erupted a few months ago. It erupted right before we went there. They're not usually terribly impressive, but they can disrupt. The eruptions can actually cause enough ash to go up into the atmosphere that it can disturb air travel. Sometimes they have to close the airports. There really hasn't been a major eruption, destructive eruption, for several centuries. I think the last one was in like the 1600s. But it is not uncommon every year or two for there to be ash and visible lava coming out of the volcano. And so, of course, the location of this theater takes advantage of that incredible natural view. It is one of the largest theaters in the ancient world. It was built by the Greeks, but most of what you're seeing here was actually rebuilt several centuries later by the Romans when they were in charge of Sicily. And I just wanted to show you a reconstruction, artist's reconstruction of what the theater would have looked like. There would have been an enormous multi-staged screen. This is looking south again. If we head towards the top of the screen, so Mount Etna would have been off in this direction behind the stage. And the fabric roofing that you can see here, which would have been something along the lines of canvas, would have protected the audience from the elements, which could be rain, more often likely sun, which would have made it a very hot place to sit for a long period of time to observe a performance. So they had these wooden frames with the fabric covering to protect the audience from the elements. Right below the theater, there's a very swanky hotel, which we didn't stay in. It had some lovely gardens and a view of the mountains. And there's a central piazza, which I loved. When we were there, it was kind of unusual weather. We were there in the fall, and Sicily, Italy, all in general, had a very unusual summer with a lot of rain, which actually caused some problems for Italy because rain is certainly nice in a climate, a Mediterranean climate that can be very arid during the summer, but they actually had difficulties that year because there was too much rain, and that can cause problems for some of the crops that they tend to grow there, that wine, cactus, almonds, citrus fruits, and so forth, olives, that don't actually like too much rain. So it was actually kind of a bad year climate-wise for them. But we spent some time on this gorgeous piazza watching the enormous thunderclouds coming in across the ocean. It was quite an impressive sight. And of course, there was torrential rain, which worked its way down these narrow little streets. And so it was kind of fun to have this alternating brilliant sun and then torrential downpours that turned the different stairways in the city into little waterfalls. So we took refuge during one of these storms in the cathedral, which is very old. It's a 13th century building. It's quite simple inside. And it was kind of fun. They had because the rain was so intense and lasted for at least 2 or 3 hours, a bunch of locals who attend the church and are part of the choir had an impromptu choral concert to amuse people while we were stuck inside during the torrential rain. So that was kind of enjoyable. Here's some views of the inside, sacred and profane. There's this beautiful image of the apse of the cathedral on the left, but on the right you can see something a little bit different, which is a wax head of one of the important clerics that's connected with the history of the church, and also the votive candles, which are not actually candles, they're electric. So you can put a coin in instead of lighting a candle the way you often do in Catholic churches in Europe. In this case, you drop a euro coin into the slot and it lights up an electric light bulb. So yeah, rain. This woman on the right actually gave up because it was so wet. She took off her shoes and just walked barefoot because it was easier. So again, as I said, if the weather's bad, you have no choice but to go inside and do shopping or eat. So we had a delicious meal inside with spicy fried calamari, some crusty Italian bread, local wines. Sicilian food is, as Robert said in the introduction, Sicily has it's Italy, but it's got its own culture, its own attitudes, its own ideas of, it has a very specific personality. And the cuisine itself is influenced by that. It's a little spicier than a lot of other Italian food, particularly since it's been influenced significantly by North Africa, which is not far away, and also the Levant. So there's influences from Lebanese and Turkish food and Greek food and so forth. So it's an interesting mix with a strong base of Italian cooking, but with all these other influences mixed in. I'm a big fan of old Italian cars. This is one of the original Fiat 500s that was built from the late 1950s till about the mid 70s or so. But you can still see lots of them all over the road. People drive them even today. They're a very popular classic car, a very quintessential city car for Italy. And they have remade them. You may have seen a few of them running around the US. In fact, we have one here in Massachusetts that looks exactly like this. I drive a little Fiat, little white Fiat, just like this. They started the new ones in 2007 for the 50th anniversary of the original. The problem with driving them, we had a rental car when we were there, and it was exactly the same car that we have here in Massachusetts. But the problem is, there are so many of them that it's almost impossible to find your car, because half the cars in Sicily are little white Fiats. So the only way that we could find them in this parking garage was to actually click the little fob and see which of the Fiats lit up. Just some scenes around Taormina. Above the city of Taormina is a small village that you can go up to that's like another 1,000 feet up the mountain, called Castelmola. It's much smaller, but it's worth driving up there for the fantastic views. You can actually walk too if you want to do that. There's a hiking trail that connects the two, or you can drive. The fun thing about being up there is the view down to Taormina, which you can see now below us. So if you think the view from Taormina was spectacular, wait until you go up another 1,000 feet. Here you can see the road that works its way up the side of the mountain. On the spur over here, you can see the castle that guards the hilltop above the city of Taormina. It's was originally a Norman castle, and of course, as different cultures invaded Sicily over the centuries, it was altered and changed and rebuilt by different cultures through that time. And certainly, if you're in this area, you need to spend some time on Mount Etna. Italy actually has the only active volcanoes in Europe right now. Mount Etna, which is the biggest, and Stromboli, which is is a small island off the north coast of Italy, which if you followed the news at all, you may have seen that in the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, Stromboli has erupted quite spectacularly, at least 2 or 3 times recently. And of course, then there's Vesuvius, which for the time being is inactive, but you never know. And Etna is a very accessible volcano because it's so close to the coast and it's so close to the major cities in Sicily. I mentioned earlier, it's about 11,000 feet high, and it's huge. It's about 90 miles if you drive all the way around the base. And it actually isn't just a single cone. There are several different peaks at different heights. You can climb all the way up to the top. This is a close-up of the ground just to show you the sulfur. The colors are beautiful because there are so many different minerals that are deposited from the gases and the eruptions. And you can see, just if you're into geology at all, it's fascinating to see all the different types of stone that come out of the mountain. And the colors are just beautiful. You can drive part way up. So if you're not a mountain climber, that's okay. There's a spot about halfway up Etna where you can park and do some relatively easy hikes. And that's also the starting point for taking a hike all the way up the mountain, which you really need to do with a guide, because it can be extremely dangerous if you are just wandering around on your own. So you can hire a guide who will take you up to the very top. We weren't able to do that just because the weather wasn't cooperating. In fact, we saw a bunch of people who were starting off on one of those guided hikes, and it started to rain and sleet very badly right after they went up. And I just thought how miserable that hike must have been for those poor people. In fact, the day that we were there, it was about 70 degrees and sunny down at sea level. And if you drove up Mount Etna, the temperature dropped at least 30, even maybe 40 degrees. It was close to freezing at the top, completely cloudy and very cold and unpleasant. So you have to kind of take all those things into account. It's very weather dependent, whether you can get to the top, and it can also be dependent on whether it's erupting at any given moment. What looks like vegetation, this green that you can see off in the distance, is actually not plant life. It looks like it might be mosses or lichens or something like that, but it's actually sulfur deposits. None of that is plant life. It's all mineral deposits. And to give you just a little bit of scale, here are some people walking around one of the smaller cones, the little side cones, which themselves are pretty impressive. So again, even if you don't have the opportunity or the ability to do a major hike or climb, you can drive up enough that you can experience a little bit of what the mountain is like and what the geology is like without having to do anything too strenuous. Because the weather was lousy on a cold day, we just said, we did a short hike and then said, oh, okay, we're going back to the cafe and had a nice warm Italian espresso. And the food that you can see on the right is called an arancini, which are very popular in Sicily, all over Italy, in fact, but specifically in the south. They are fried rice balls. And if you've never had one, you can definitely get them here in Massachusetts because many Italian restaurants will serve them. They're made of the arborio kind of rice, that the short grain rice that's used in risotto, and they are deep fried. They form them into balls. And usually they're stuffed with either meat or cheese, vegetables, all different kinds of flavorings, and then they deep fry them. And they're called arancini. That's because they are the size and color of an orange. That's the Italian word for orange. And they're great street food. You can easily pick them up in little street vendors in many of the cities. And they're very warm and filling, particularly on a cold day. We're going to start heading along the coast now, the northern coast, and you can see some of the fertile landscape around Mount Etna, which has a lot of evidence of past lava flows over many centuries. And a good thing about all of this volcanic activity is it makes it a very lush area for certain kinds of agriculture, particularly grapes. So there's a lot of vineyards around the foothills of Mount Etna. You can see some of them off in the distance. It's also very good for olive growing. And many of the Sicilian wines come from this part of the eastern part of Sicily on the slopes of Mount Etna. There are very good, very minerally tasting white wines and also some very strong reds. A nice thing about the Sicilian wines is they often are very inexpensive. They're delicious, and many of them are imported into stores around here. And you can get a lot of really, really good Sicilian wines for $10 a bottle or less. So I would encourage you to try some of them if you see them in wine stores around the area. Here you can see lots of leftover lava flow, which could be from decades or even centuries ago. And much of that stone is later used in building, stone walls, buildings, and so forth. The area north of Mount Etna is called the Nebrodi Mountains. It's actually a national park. And along with the Madonie Mountains, which are kind of next to them. This whole park area along the north coast is very beautiful, very sparsely populated, except for a few mountain villages. And the peaks are pretty high. They reach over about 5,000 feet. And because they're so close to the ocean, they seem even higher than they actually are. It's a very forested part of the island. There's a lot of beech trees, cork trees, and evergreen forests as well. We're driving just in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and here's some wild pigs just walking around. And as you work your way along the coast, there's a number of really beautiful mountain villages that you can see. This is a small one called San Marco d'Alunzio, which is about 1,800 feet up over the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Tyrrhenian is the one that's on the north side of the island. Many of these towns were built in the mountains, of course, for protective reasons. These are not, these aren't seaside resort towns like you might expect today. These were built centuries ago, so they weren't built on the coast, which would have been dangerous because of pirates and other invasions. They were built for protection way up in the mountains, but they have views up and down the coast. And many of them, even though you can see the coast very closely from them, it can take a half an hour or more because of all the little twisty roads that you have to take to get up to them. This particular one has 22 churches for a tiny little town, and also an ancient Greek temple. because the Greeks were in Italy. It was a Greek colony for a very long time. It was called Magna Graecia. And in fact, Sicily has some of the most well-preserved and beautiful Greek ruins. Ironically, there are some amazing Greek temples. I'm going to show you one of them a little bit later. And here you can see the view if we look west along the coast towards Palermo. So I would recommend, if you visit, to just pick almost any random town. It doesn't have to be one that's mentioned in the guidebooks. They're just explore on your own and pick little towns, and you will find the most beautiful little nooks and crannies, lots of little pedestrian alleyways, medieval style streets, and houses built on top of each other. You can, off in the distance here, through this archway, you can see a couple of islands off in the distance. Those are the Aeolian Islands. There are 3 or 4 little island groups off the coast of Sicily. The Aeolians are the one that includes Stromboli, the one that has been erupting frequently. And you can take trips there are often day trips if you want. Most of the island groups are close enough that you can see them from the coast, and you can take a day trip out to them, but they're probably they're interesting enough that it's worth taking longer to do that, and making it into a weekend or something like that where you can explore a little bit more. We didn't have the time to do that, but I would love to go back and visit some of those islands later. Here's the Greek temple I mentioned. This is actually a 4th century BC temple to Hercules, which was converted later into a church, which is why it has some of these unusual designs and windows, because it was a Christian church for a long period of time. Here's a better view of some of the Aeolians just off the coast. And views all the way along the west. We're heading towards Palermo, which is kind of off in this distance here. I think my favorite place in the north was this town called Cefalù, which is one of Sicily's most popular tourist destinations, partly for its history and its architecture, and also partly because it's one of the towns that's actually on the coast with a lot of very nice beaches and boating and seaside activities. The main site to see in the town is this spectacular Norman cathedral, which I'll show you in just a sec. It's a Greek name, again, going back to the Greeks, back when this was a Greek colony. The name Cefalù is an Italian altered version of the Greek word kefalos, which means head, which refers in this case to a headland, which is this huge cliff that looms behind the town. It's about 900 feet high, and there's the ruins of a fortress up at the top, because obviously this would have been a very good place to build a fortress. It's halfway along the coast. You can see in both directions, and it makes a very protected location. Nowadays, Cefalù is instead just a very popular seaside place with lots of tourist shops and restaurants and cafes and narrow little streets, and a lot of boating. We had a great little hotel, which this is actually inside our hotel room. We had a tiny little balcony that looked out over the ocean, and it even came with a bottle of Sicilian red wine, which to me is like a really great way to start your visit. And like many Italian towns, it has narrow streets with people hanging their laundry out on the balconies, and about every 10 feet there's a church. And the biggest one is in the Cathedral Square, which you can see here. This is a Norman-style cathedral. It was built in the 12th century, or started to build in the 12th century. Note the towers. The towers are a little, they may strike you as not very Christian looking, and they aren't really, because a lot of the early Norman construction at this time period in Sicily was heavily influenced by Moorish architecture, throughout the Mediterranean when, again, so many other cultural influences were going on, that there was a sort of mixture of Norman, Byzantine, Arabic design that became very popular in Sicily. So these almost might strike you as Arabian style or North African style or Spanish style towers, and that's because they are. And the inside also has that feel too. The interior was changed in the 1500s, but you can still see the original Byzantine mosaics, which are some of the most famous in the world. This is, if you like Byzantine architecture, this is definitely an important pilgrimage site. You can see Christ up in the apse, and it's one of the best examples of early Byzantine mosaic. And I should emphasize that this is mosaic. This is not painting. These are not frescoes. These are not painted. What you're seeing is tiny little mosaic tiles made out of precious stones or ceramic or glass or gold, which is why centuries later they retain an incredibly vivid color. They're, despite being almost 900 years old. There's also because this is such an old church, there's a mix of Baroque and Renaissance additions later on, which is true of many of the churches in Sicily. It's a fantastic town to just kind of stroll around, and particularly at night. It's all lit up at night. You can see, because it's on a headland, you can see the sunset over the sea, people fishing on the piers, and then the late afternoon sun turns the entire town into a warm glow, Mediterranean glow. And then you can just find a restaurant. Has really nice street life. Because the town is so densely packed, most of the streets are pedestrianized, which makes it a lot more enjoyable to stroll around. Of course, being on the ocean, it has a lot of seafood restaurants or gelato. And they even light up the rock at night, which is pretty impressive. This, again, is a very old city. So after the Greeks left, the Romans were there, and there are even these ruins here are of old Roman thermal baths, which were used as public baths as late as the medieval period. Now it's just a little historic site that you can tuck your, it's tucked off in a corner and you can stick your head in and see what it looks like. This was the view from our hotel room the following morning as the sun comes up over the headland and lights up the coast with the eastern morning sun. That's a good time to climb the headland if you plan on doing that, because it's a little cooler in the mornings. It's called La Rocca for obvious reasons. It's a huge rock. And there's a Saracen castle at the top. And the ruins are interesting, but just as enjoyable is the view down, looking out over the town with an excellent view of the cathedral right below you and views up and down the coast. There is even an extremely old temple. This goes back to the Greeks. This is an ancient Greek temple to Diana. Well, Diana is the Roman goddess Artemis, essentially. And it's on the site of an even earlier settlement from the 9th century BC, when there was a megalithic settlement on top of the rock. So there are, again, layers and layers and layers of history in this one small location. And eventually you can get up to the castle itself, which gives you amazing views up and down the coast. You can see how mountainous this part of Sicily is. The southern coast has a much more gradual landscape that slowly, there are mountains in the center and they sort of slope down to the southern coast. So there's more agriculture on the south than you tend to see in the north just because of the landscape. And typical Italian street life. In the morning, all the guys come out, get their coffee, and talk about politics and how to solve all the world's problems. Working our way again towards Palermo, we stopped in another little town called Caccamo, much less touristy than Cefalù, partly because it's inland. It's on a rocky outcrop, maybe half an hour inland from the coast. And it is dominated by this massive castle, which is now a museum that you can visit. Like many structures like this, it was actually built over a period of several centuries, but it started in the 12th century. And it looks out over this beautiful town in the mountains with views towards the inland part of Sicily, which is a little bit more pastoral. And because it's so high up, you can see mountains in pretty much every direction. The museum is really excellent because it's been restored to the medieval time period when it was the primary power in this part of the coastline. And it's in excellent condition. And it's not very far from there to the biggest thing along the northern coast, which is Palermo. We are in a small suburb called Monreale, and which means Royal Mountain, just like it does in Canada, where we have Mont Royal. And the city that you can see as we look north towards the ocean is the city of Palermo, which is the largest city in Sicily, and it's the capital of the region. Centuries ago, the Bishop of Palermo decided to move for safety reasons a few miles inland, which is why he ended up on this little hilltop, a little bit protected from the ocean, to this town, this little hill town. And the reason why you might bother to go to Monreale is to see the incredible architecture that's there, particularly the cathedral and the monastery that's there today. It has some nice little streets as well, and delicious bakeries. But the highlight, of course, is the cathedral, which was built remarkably quickly for a cathedral. It was built in the 1180s over a period of 4 years, which for that time period was very, very quick. One of the things about building that quickly is it means that the style and design of the building is pretty homogeneous. And it wasn't until centuries later that other additions that I'll show you changed some of the way it looks. Along with the cathedral in Cefalù that we just saw, and a few other churches in Sicily, it is now part of a UNESCO heritage site, because they all are built roughly in the same era and in a very similar architectural style, which is unique to Sicily. And again, like the one in Cefalù, you can see this sort of Moorish, is almost Islamic influence to the style. So it has this incredible exterior decoration, but it's the interior that is really spectacular. It's almost completely covered with 12th and 13th century Byzantine mosaics, which show scenes from both the New and the Old Testament. The roof, which unusually for a church of this time period is made of wood instead of stone, is beautiful painted wood. Part of that is because Sicily is a very earthquake-prone region, and building a stone roof on a building of this size can be very dangerous. And in fact, many of these buildings were originally built with stone roofs, and then later on they collapsed, and they rebuilt them with wood because, whoops, excuse me, my home office has Hey,
You always keep things interesting, Jeff.
yep. Live television, right? My home office faces in exactly the right direction so that at this time of day, the sun blinds me through the window. And my window shade just hurled upwards. Anyway, that's fixed for the moment. Sorry about that. So back to the church. You can see some of the most incredible mosaics. And again, I need to emphasize, these are not painted. These are mosaics. So all the artwork that you can see here, not the roof beams, but the walls, the arches, this is all mosaic work that is made of tiny, tiny, tiny little bits of stone, glass, ceramic, gold, and so forth, which is why they retain their incredibly vivid colors after such a long period of time. Here's a better view of the ceiling. This is definitely, this particular church, if you visit Sicily and read a guidebook that says like top 10 things to do in Sicily, this is going to be close to the top because it is certainly one of the most spectacular churches you'll see anywhere in Europe. And it's also interesting because, as I mentioned, many European churches have been rebuilt and added on to over the centuries. So there's a Baroque wing or chapel off to the side that is in a completely different style because it was built several centuries later. And you can see the difference between the two here, the Byzantine versus the Baroque. Here are some of the scenes from the Old Testament. You can even see Noah's Ark here. And then here's the Baroque chapel, which is completely over the top, decorated with marble and incredibly detailed sculptures, mostly from the 17th and 18th centuries. In a completely different style. And then on the floor is this detailed tile work made out of marble that could be in almost any Islamic building. Very Moorish in style, so you might expect to see something like this in North Africa or the Middle East or Moorish Spain. So this style where Moorish and Christian designs were kind of mixed together is pretty much unique to Sicily. And there's a number of these amazing churches that have it. It's also got a superb cloister, which you can see here, that was built a couple of decades after the church was, and it's still incredibly beautiful. You can climb up onto the top and get a view. You can actually walk across the top of the roof of the cathedral for views of the city and the complex itself. And you can even look back down into the church inside the nave. And there's a beautiful view looking north towards the sea, where the city of Palermo is. And the piazza that's in front of the church. The cloister is beautiful in and of itself with these incredible detailed columns. There's over 200 columns, each of which has a unique carving in Romanesque style, but there are all kinds of different representations of mostly of biblical scenes. And they're in extremely good condition. Back in the main city of Palermo, it's also, again, very old, 2,700 years old, in fact, and it's the capital of Sicily. It's a very big city. It's probably about the size of Boston. And as you can tell from this picture, it has incredible street life. We were there during a festival, although I should point out that festivals in Palermo are not uncommon because they seem to have them almost every week or two. So it's not unlikely that you might stumble upon one while you're there. From the early 1600s, this central intersection that we're looking at here is called the Quattro Canti, where two roads cross, and there are four buildings, one on each corner, that were designed and built to look the same, to form an ensemble. And there's a fountain in front of each one of them, each representing the four seasons, which is why it's called the Quattro Canti. I love mistranslated menus, so I was fascinated by the idea that this is, I don't know what wrong tiramisu is. How can there ever be a wrong tiramisu? All tiramisus are right. Or you can get a cannolo that is decomposed. But honestly, the food in Palermo is fantastic. There's tons and tons of restaurants with all different kinds of cuisine. But if you like Sicilian cooking, it's a big foodie city. Here's some grilled octopus on a bed of sweet potato that was absolutely delicious. And it's a city that it's at night, strolling around is just, it's delightful. Palermo gets a bad rap because it's described as a very dangerous city, and we didn't really find that at all. Like any place that you might travel, you have to be reasonably cautious about pickpocketing and things like that. But violent crime against tourists is actually pretty rare in Palermo. There are some bad neighborhoods, but you're not likely to end up in those as a tourist. And the downtown area where you're most likely to spend your time and where most of the major sites are is full of people at all hours of the day and night. So as long as you're taking reasonable tourist precautions, you shouldn't feel bad about going to or wandering around Palermo. Driving, on the other hand, we drove into Palermo, and that's quite an adventure. Although I think if you can drive in Boston, you can drive in Italy. And there's so much traffic that it doesn't move very fast. So yeah, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And again, since there was a festival, all the streets were lit up, and a lot of them have been blocked off for pedestrian access. And they light up everything at night. Palermo has, I don't know how many churches, many of which are in this elaborate Baroque style. The facades are just incredible. This is a much later building from the late 19th century, into the turn of the 20th. Called the Teatro Massimo. So it's a more neoclassical building. A very typical European opera house style. It's known for having extremely good acoustics. So if you have a chance to hear a performance, that might be worth it. And here's another of the many churches. This is San Domenico. And I always like being in places when there happens to be a festival, because you can see the locals celebrating. The following morning, here are some of the major sites in Palermo. Again, this is the same theater that we were just seeing, only in the daytime. See a little bit better. Whoops. And there are any number of different churches from different time periods that are worth visiting. The oratorio of San Domenico is spectacular because of all these very Rococo sculptures that you can see inside. It's well known because of the artist that worked on it, whose name was Giacomo Serpota. He was a Rococo sculptor of the 17th and 18th centuries. The sculptures you can see here are not made of marble. They're actually made of stucco. And the reason that's important is that stucco is much lighter. You're not carving in actual stone. So it allows for a little bit more plasticity in the sculptures. They can come out of the wall more easily because they're not as heavy. And this was a style also unique to Sicily. Serpotto was very influential in this time period. And the Rococo Rococo is kind of a style that you can think of Baroque, but even more so. Extremely elaborate, extremely over-the-top decoration. And there's a number of churches throughout Sicily that have Serpotto's work, which really represents the flowering of this Italian Rococo style, along with other artists who imitated him. Italy is like a lot of other southern Mediterranean countries where there are cats everywhere. And if you like cats, they can be very photogenic. The center of Palermo is a city called Piazza Pretoria, with a very famous fountain with all of these ancient heroes and gods. And right adjacent to it are a couple of very important churches. The one on the right with these funny little reddish domes is called San Cataldo, and the Martorana church is on the left. They're very interesting because you can see, again, a mix of styles. The Martorana is an Italian-Albanian church, kind of interesting. It's Catholic, although it celebrates using the Eastern Catholic rite, so it's very specific. And it has, you can see in this picture, right next to each other in different parts of the church, you can see the original Byzantine style right next to the Baroque style that was added later. So it's 12th century and 16th, 17th, 18th centuries kind of jammed up against each other. And that's partly because it was absorbed at some point by a convent of Benedictine nuns. So they changed a lot of the interior and added their own artwork. It's a very small church, so seeing all this decoration crammed into a small space is very impressive. You can even see it in the floor design, where right next to each other you see that very Moorish Byzantine style right next to a more Western European Baroque style in the floor tiles. On the other hand, San Cataldo, which is the church right next door with the little domes, is very austere inside, completely different. And it's a very good example of that Arab Norman style that is found really only in Sicily, and is also very old, goes back to the 12th century, like the other church, but has not really been altered inside. So it's much more simple, very serene inside. And this is the outside. Another fun thing to do in Palermo is to enjoy a lot of the street markets. There are several of them in different neighborhoods. The busiest one is called the Mercato del Ballarò, which is huge. It goes on for blocks and blocks. And you will find fish, meat, produce, household goods. It's like an outdoor museum. So even if you're not going to buy anything, it's just fun to watch the street life and see what people are growing and selling. Here are peppers and okra, all different kinds of olives, different kinds of vegetables, the delicious Italian tomatoes. And on the left, these long, weird things are actually a kind of zucchini, or they're like zucchini. It's a very long, skinny squash called cucuzza. And of course, plenty of seafood because it's Sicily. So there's fresh fish, and here you have calamari and octopus. One of the big sights to see, probably the big sight to see in Palermo, in the downtown area, is the Palace of the Normans, which is now used as the Royal Palace of Sicily, and the government, it's the regional parliament building at this point. It has beautiful gardens. And you can also tour the inside, the highlight of which is the Cappella Palatina, which is another example of that incredibly beautiful 12th century Byzantine Arab Norman style. So again, it's completely covered with mosaics. And because this is such a small space, it feels almost like a jewel box, just gold from top to bottom. It was commissioned by a king in the 1100s, early 1100s, and took about 8 years to construct. And it's incredible. You could kind of think of it almost as the Sistine Chapel, but Byzantine. It has 3 apses, which is unusual for this style of church. And the decoration is just amazing, particularly the ceiling, which is kind of hard to see here. What's unusual about it is that it is a very Arab style ceiling mostly from Moorish North Africa, and it's called mukarnas. You can't really tell as much from these photographs, but it's made of wood, painted wood, and it almost has stalactites, these pendants that hang down from the ceiling and are painted in this very Moorish style. And it's very unusual to see this in a Christian church. Here's just some more scenes of the interior. And again, like some of the other churches we've seen, it has a painted wooden ceiling rather than a stone ceiling with arches. So gilded and painted artwork on the roof beams. Here's God and Adam. Here, in fact, you can even see God creating Eve out of Adam's rib. Adam's rib, sorry. In addition to the chapel, you can also visit the rest of the palace, which dates from many centuries later. And it was a royal palace for many centuries, and is now used for the Sicilian government, the regional parliament. And you can tour a lot of the staterooms, which have a completely different style, because we're talking about mostly the 17th, 18th century. The Porta Nuova, which is part of this complex, meaning the new gate, even though it's not new, to us at least, it was built in 1570, and it has some unusual Moorish statues on it, and it's a big triumphal gate that leads into the palace complex up on the hill. We had to stop again for more arancini, of course, and fresh squeezed orange juice. Sicily is big into citrus, so you can find fresh squeezed orange juice pretty much everywhere. Palermo also has its own cathedral, which is kind of a mishmash of styles over several centuries. And the interior isn't quite as fun as the outside, but it's worth a visit anyway, particularly to see some of the exterior designs. The interior, on the other hand, is kind of disappointing. It's rather drab and very neoclassical, but it has some fun little chapels that you can see. The one on the left here is worth noting because of who it's dedicated to. It has the tomb of Pino Puglisi, who was an anti-mafia priest who was murdered on his birthday, of all days, in 1993. He was shot outside his home in Palermo. He was a very outspoken anti-mafia figure in Italian politics, and he died because of it. And there is a memorial in his honor. Italy and Sicily in particular have been trying for decades to reduce the influence of the mafia, and that has been successful to some degree. Certainly things have changed significantly from, say, 50 years ago. And as a tourist traveling in Sicily, tourists are not targeted by the mafia. Mafia these days is mostly involved in things like corrupt building contracts and financial dealings and things like that. But they still exist, and they are still an important influence kind of in the background of a lot of Italian politics. This cathedral does have one interesting feature, which is this meridian that goes down the middle of the floor. It's a line that shows the transit of the sun. There's a hole in the roof, and the sunlight will move its way along through the signs of the zodiac. You can see Pisces and Scorpio here. And there's a number of royal tombs. Again, this was the capital of Sicily and the most important church. So here you will find a lot of tombs of various important royal figures throughout Sicilian history. I personally found the exterior far more interesting than the interior. And like the other church that we were on up in the suburbs, you can also climb the towers and get an amazing view out over from the roof out over the center of the city. Here you can see that opera house a few blocks away, and some summer Italian weather heading our direction. Another kind of off the beaten path thing to do when you're in Palermo is to visit the Capuchin Monastery, which has, as you can see here, a kind of macabre set of catacombs that has thousands of mummified bodies in it. Some are monks from the monastery. Others are just, it's a cemetery that was used for the city. So it started as a place to bury the friars from the monastery, but other people wanted to be buried the same way. So it's been used that way for at least a couple hundred years. And it's so big now that they've actually organized it into, it's organized into different zones by sex and by profession and by age. Some families are buried together. It's very creepy if you like this sort of thing. And the last burials were done in the 1920s, so nothing's been done since then. But it's an interesting place to stop if you like things that are a little bit different. I just like the name of the Titi School, which was a nursery school in Palermo. And just some more scenes of the city at night. As we finish the program, I'm heading towards the coast, where we're going to stop just briefly in one of the most important Greek sites. This is called Segesta, another very old site. For the original Sicilian people, no one's quite sure where they came from, but the area was Hellenized when it became a Greek colony. And that was kind of around the 5th century BC when most of the monuments were built. This is an interesting one because it's in very good condition. It's a Doric temple built in the same time period as the Parthenon in Athens and a number of other important Greek temples. But this one's kind of interesting because it was never finished. And you can tell that it was never finished because the columns are not fluted. That would have been done later after they had been constructed. And these little tabs that you can see sticking out from the stones would have been used to help lift the stones and move them into place. And after the completion of the temple, those would have all been chopped off and smoothed. So the fact that you can still see them is an indication that the temple was far from completion. But it is a very beautiful example of Doric architecture, and particularly because of its location, which is kind of off in the middle of nowhere. And it has this beautiful pink stone, and its setting underneath this mountain off in the countryside is very beautiful. It was built at the nexus of several roads in this time period, so it had views in all directions. And it wasn't just a temple, it was also a settlement. You can see the modern highway in the distance here. But the site was inhabited well into the Middle Ages. There's even a Norman castle nearby, and some churches and ruins of mosques from different time periods, along with this well-preserved classical amphitheater that is still there as well. It is thought that Segesta as a city at the time was a rival of a town that we won't see today called Selinunte, which is on the south coast. And they asked for assistance from Athens and for military and financial assistance. And they thought that it would help if they built a number of monuments to make Athens think that they were way more important than they actually were. This was actually a pretty small settlement. It didn't really work because Segesta never became as important as any of the other Greek colonies in Sicily. So now it's kind of just an off the beaten path Greek colony. And if we work our way towards the coast, we're going to stop for a couple days in Erice, which is a ancient Phoenician town, although most of what you see is obviously much later. But 2,500 feet up, it's on a mountain, and as you can see from this aerial view, it's kind of triangular in shape and completely surrounded by protective walls. The cathedral is on the left. So it was specifically built here because of its incredible protective location and its views. You can pretty much see for miles and miles in every direction, off, in fact, to another bunch of offshore islands called the Agadi Islands. We stayed in a wonderful little hotel that had this comfy and frumpy hotel lounge and some nice little terraces. It's a delightful town because it can get very touristy during the day, but at night it's deathly quiet, and all you can hear are footsteps on the stone streets. There's a number of churches. In fact, there's something like 20 to 30 different churches in this tiny little town, and spectacular views down to the large port of Trapani, which is a major, more modern port. Unfortunately, these radio towers don't help the view. And there's a nice walking tour of many of the different churches. Here's the cathedral inside that has this beautiful decoration, which actually is much later. The ceiling is mostly from the 19th century, but very elaborate. And many of the churches in this town are from a later time period. There's not much Byzantine here. Most of what you're going to see here is Baroque, Rococo, and like 17th to 18th century churches. And many of them are tiny, these little teeny chapels. And you walk in and there's just the most incredible decoration in a church that may not be much bigger than your living room. Most of the town is pedestrianized, which of course makes it very pleasant to stroll around. Has some very nice museums, and the view is, of course, also incredible. The mountain that you can see in the distance, Cofano, is a natural refuge, a nature preserve, where you can go hiking. And the blocky building that you can see in the foreground was built to house soldiers during the Spanish rule, although it was never really used. Here's just a couple of examples of some of the incredible churches that you can see. And the views of the surrounding countryside. There are 3 castles piled on top of each other in this part of Erice. One is a 12th century Norman castle that's built over the ruins of a Roman temple. And then the second is this weird little thing that you can see here called the Torretta Pepoli, which is a late 19th century folly that was built as a private residence by a wealthy guy. And both of them are now museums that you can tour, and they have really nice views. And the third one is the Castello di Venere, which is named because it was built with materials from the old Temple of Venus that was up on the top of this mountain. It's more kind of a mystery. This very impressive castle is now privately owned. For a while, it was a very fancy hotel, but it's been, I haven't looked recently, but at the time that we were there, it was indefinitely closed. There had been talk that it might be reopened as another hotel, but I don't think that's actually happened. So right now it's just, it's closed up. But the ruins have amazing views to the Agadi Islands. And you can see the interior of the Norman castle and the foundations of the early temple to Venus. And again, views off to the very far west. There's an interesting tradition of local crafts in this town. They make these wax religious figures, which are either, depending on your perspective, they're either kind of creepily ugly or incredibly beautiful and detailed. To me, they were a little mix of both. But it's a long-standing tradition in the city, and as elsewhere in Sicily, they also make these figures that are carried in various festival processions. They live in the church during the year, and then during whichever festival they are appropriate to, they're paraded around the town. But for a tiny, tiny little medieval hill town, the amount of church architecture is just stunning in such a small space. It also has a very strong tradition of suites. The convents that used to be in Erice were for a long time known for making marzipan, which you can see here in this store. They also made a very local pastry filled with custard, which is very typical, and a lot of different kinds of cookies. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I highly recommend a book called Bitter Almonds, which is a memoir written by an author named Maria Grammatico. And she interviewed older women who had grown up in the convents to describe their lives living in the convents decades ago and growing up making these sweets as a tradition in this town. Back then, of course, it was not a very touristy location like it is today. So it's an interesting slice of life. If you have any interest in the history of small town Sicily. The hill is actually very forested. Here's some more food. And views out over the western coast. Again, remember, we're about as not quite as far west as you can get, but very far west in Sicily. And nighttime is a beautiful time in Erice because you can watch the sun go down over the different buildings and church domes and the castles. And the western sun, of course, lights up all of the buildings with a warm glow. And then night falls. And you have the town to yourself, pretty much looking like this. And at this point, there's really nothing to do but go find a good restaurant and have a delicious Sicilian meal for dinner. So I'll end the program there because we have a few minutes to look at questions. I'm going to stop my share. If you have not go through the If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now if you haven't already. But let me see if I can make sure we check into the questions. Okay, is it true
Yeah,
that
so
the
Jeff,
size?
oh, go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Is it true that the size of the theater is some indication of the population at the time? I would say it kind of has to be. Any place that has a theater of that size in the ancient world certainly would have had to be a big enough settlement to accommodate that kind of population. But I would qualify that by saying it doesn't necessarily have to have been a city, because a number of places in the ancient world were, what's the word I'm looking for? They were places of pilgrimage. They might have been shrines, essentially, to a particular god. So it wasn't necessarily a city where people lived and the way we would think of a modern city today. It could have been a location like Olympia in Greece, which was mainly a place for the Olympian Games. And yes, there's a certain amount of residences and stores because it has to have people, enough people to keep it going. But you might often find places dedicated to a particular god that were not cities the way we think of them, but they were still major centers of activity. And they might have also had a theater like that too. Is the property closest to Mount Etna more valuable than the property farther away from it? That's a good question. I have no idea, because you could imagine it going either way. The closer you get to Mount Etna, the more likely you are to be affected by any kind of eruptions from Mount Etna. Although, like I said, a lot of the area around the foothills of Etna is prized agricultural land, particularly for wine production. There are a lot of villas in the foothills, and so I have no idea how Italian house insurance works, but that's a good question. Etna is very close to a lot of very developed areas. In fact, the city that's closest to it, and why am I blanking on the name? Catania. Catania is the second largest city. It's on the East Coast, very close to Etna, and has been affected many times over history from eruptions, and is in fact almost completely built of lava rock. So who knows what's going to happen? Etna could, I think geologists think that it's good that Etna keeps erupting just little bits at a time, because that's much better than having it be dormant for centuries and then blow its top spectacularly. So I don't really know, but I personally would not buy anything very close to Etna. How difficult was the driving? Not at all. You might think Sicily might have a reputation for dangerous driving. I think it depends on your own level of how you drive. Again, if you can drive in Boston, you can easily drive in Sicily. The cities can be a little crazy, like driving around downtown Palermo. It's a very busy city. But driving on the highways, there's almost nobody on the highways in Sicily. And the country roads, there's some twizzly mountain roads and country driving, but it certainly was no worse than any other place in Europe that I've traveled. It really depends, I think, mostly on how comfortable you feel with driving. If you're scared of narrow mountain roads, yeah, probably it might not be your best thing. A good thing about Sicily, if you don't like that sort of thing, is there are many tours that will do, say in 8 or 10 days, we'll do a circuit of many of the things that we looked at, and you can have somebody else do the driving and still see the same scenery and the same interesting historic monuments along the way. But I wouldn't be afraid of driving in Sicily. It's really I thought it was a delightful place to drive. And I enjoy driving in places like that because you can set your own pace, and there are so many things to see that are off in the countryside where there really isn't a lot of public transportation. So don't be afraid of driving there. How does one enter Sicily? You can do it a couple of different ways. Air is certainly the easiest, and the two big places that you would fly into are Catania on the east coast or Palermo on the west. Those are the two main airports. And they are very, very accessible from Rome. A flight from Rome is an hour, give or take, maybe a little over an hour. So it's very easy to get there. And yes, there are also ferries. They obviously take a little bit longer if you're coming from further away. But yeah, the main ferries come from the Toe and cross the Messinian Strait, which is very narrow. The problem there is that you'd have to get all the way from Rome or Naples all the way down to the Toe. There are ferries from Naples and ferries from Rome. Those take a lot longer. Sicily is also often a stop on major cruise lines that do Mediterranean cruises. But for that, you're only likely to stop in places like Palermo, Taormina for an afternoon. So if you really want to see Sicily, you'd want to go and spend some time there. Someone says there's a song referring to Cacamo. There very well could be. I'm not familiar with it, but I believe it. A lot of people, I'm not sure. Liz says that her father was born there, and yes, I know a lot of people. My family is Greek and Italian, but the Italian portion is from way in the north of Italy near Milan. But there's an awful lot of people in the Boston area who have Sicilian roots. And I know a number of them who have gone back to find their grandparents' villages and so forth. And it's an amazing experience. She also points out that Sicily has its own language. That's not really a dialect. Yeah, that's true. Actually, it's kind of both true and not true. Sicilian is a separate language. But there is also a Sicilian dialect of Italian in the sense that and if you travel there, you're going to hear mostly Italian. But it's a very regional Italian with a lot of its own vocabulary and slang expressions and so forth, like any other language, like French and German and Greek and American. We all have our little regional differences. But you're right that there is actually Sicilian is significantly different from Italian. Let's see. Catacombs. Someone asks whether the amphitheaters still have performances. Yes, they do. The one in Taormina in particular, it has been completely redone to have more comfortable benches to sit on. And they do performances throughout the year. Did I drink tap water or bottled? Bottled water is always a good idea, and Italy has delicious bottled water, both still and fizzy. But it is perfectly safe to drink the tap water in Italy. Let's see. Someone asked about best places to see around Mount Etna. Kalashibeta. Yes, I remember that. Diane, if you are still in the program, email me and I will be happy to talk to you a little bit about some specific things to take a look at. Kalashibeta is in the southern coast. I have a separate program that covers the south of Sicily, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Someone asks if any of my programs are on YouTube. Yes, I will send a link. Not all of them, but a number of my programs are on the Wakefield Library's YouTube channel, and I'll send Robert a link that he can include in a follow-up email if you want to check out any of those. Someone mentions Inspector Montalbano. Yes, I talk about him a little bit more in the in my program on Southern Sicily, because that's where the stories take place. There is a fantastic author, and of course, now I'm going to blank on his name. I can tell Robert to include it. But yes, it's a series of detective novels written by an Italian and translated into English. His inspector is called Inspector Montalbano, and they take place in a fictionalized version of one of the southern Sicilian towns. And they are fantastic. They were also turned into a TV series, which is available on some of the streaming services. And oh God, I can't remember the author's name. I will give it to, I will make sure that Robert gets that because he can share it with you. There's probably 25 books in the series, and they are a wonderful slice of life of Sicily. Absolutely. And my email again, I think oh, thank you. Someone just pointed out, Andrea Camilleri, yes, is the author. And his books are pretty widely available in libraries around here. So definitely check those out. They're short. They have lots of food and local life. And so, yes, I would highly recommend those if you like enjoyable murder mysteries with a strong sense of place and a lot of really enjoyable, like, Sicilian dialect and characters and so forth. Now I'm checking the Q&A. Where am I going
Jeff,
next? Yep.
There is some things in the Q&A, but we are at 12:35, so we've gone almost 100 minutes here. So I think we're at the point where we're probably going to want to wrap up. If you did not get your question asked, email Jeff directly. Both Jeff and I have shared his email address in the chat. So, and I'll include that email in the follow-up email that I send all of you. And folks asked about, can Jeff come back? Can Jeff come back? Well, we are partnering with the Chelmsford Library. Let me look at my cheat sheet. So next Tuesday, in 1 week, on February 21st at 7 o'clock Eastern, so this is at night, 7 o'clock, we're staying in Italy, and we're going to Naples. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be tuning in for that one, Jeff. So that's Tuesday, February 21st at 7 o'clock. And then Jeff will be back with us here in Tewksbury on Tuesday, March 14th. So 4 weeks from this morning, Tuesday, March 14th, we'll be at our regular 10:30 time, not 11, so 10:30. And that's going to be Bucharest, Romania. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right.
Yep.
But so that's what we have coming up with Jeff. Really looking forward to that. Look for the email later today with the feedback survey, with the recording, with all that information, with Jeff's email address, and anything else Jeff wants me to include in that email, I certainly will. And Jeff, do you have any last words for the audience?
I was just going to say, I just took a copy of all the remaining questions in the Q&A, and so I will write up answers to those and send them to you so that you can include them in your email. I'll do that.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the time crunch. If we had started at 10:30, we could have gone till 12:30, but I do need to wrap it here. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again.
A lot, everyone.
Happy Valentine's Day,
next time.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.